welcome back to Nat Joe's Caffeinated Library. Today we're doing a review video for The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid. So, The Wolf and the Woodsman, this book I picked up from Barnes & Noble, and it was one of its, like, the mystery book selections where the cover is wrapped and it's like a description of the book that you buy off the description alone. So the way that read was that it was inspired by Hungarian history and Jewish folklore, enemies to lovers, huddling for warmth, ruthless protagonist, secret Cinnamon Roll love interest, forbidden love. So I picked that up and I was like, oh yes please, that's basically all my favorite tropes. So it ended up being The Wolf and the Woodsman. The back of the book, like the story synopsis, sounded super intriguing to me, and I read it. And I honestly don't know how I feel about this book. But before I get into that, so Wolf and the Woodsman is, a part of me wants to call it like a Riding Hood retelling, but that doesn't feel right. But I also kind of kept going back to that. But anyway, so The Wolf and the Woodsman is about a main character, Vicky, I think that's how Vicky. And she's the only person who lives in her little village that doesn't have a power. And the powers that her villagers have is forging, like forging metals and weapons forging, healing, and fire. And she's the only one that doesn't have a magical ability. She can't do any kind of magic at all. And so they call her Baron. And her father is out of the picture, but her father is like oh, hang on. I keep calling him the wrong thing. Yahuli? Her father is a Yahuli, which is like a group of people that lives in the capital. It's strongly implied that the Yahuli are based off of Jews. And that's pretty obvious when you read them, that they're basically the Jewish culture. And so that's her father, but her father's out of the picture. But people look down poorly on the Yahuli because they're usually tax collectors for the king and they don't like people taking their money away. So Vicky lives in this village in the middle of BFE, and a woodsman comes, so they're supposed to pay like a tithe to the king every-ish year, but not necessarily every year. So like they randomly come every often. And they take they're called wolf girls because they wear the skin of wolves, and the color of the fur denotes what kind of magic you have. So like the healers have white wolf furs, and anyway. And so she gets called Wolf Girl constantly in this book. And so the woodsman comes, they give her up because she doesn't have any magic and they don't want them to take the seer that they do have. Oh yeah, there's also the seeing. Yeah, I forgot. There's forging, healing, fire, and then the seers. And they don't want to give up the seer that they have, so they give up this chick and like pretend that she's a wolf girl. And the story ensues with Vicky and Gaspar traveling to the kingdom, and then horrible things go awry and they end up going north and then back down and stuff happens. That's the general gist of the story, is that and then you find out that Gaspar is, and this is not a spoiler because it's in the back flap, Gaspar is actually the like prince of the king and heir to the throne, but he's like been forsaken a little bit because of some family drama that we'll get into later. And so she finds out later that he's actually the prince, and he's on his own little like secret mission. Yeah, and so that's generally what this book is about. The two of them hating each other so the wolf girl, Vicky, hates the woodsman because her mother was taken when she was 15, so she blames all woodsmen for taking her mother because it's implied that the women are killed once the woodsmen take them. And then the woodsmen hate the wolf girls because they're pagans in this book, and they don't... Hey Google, stop talking. Nothing like being home alone and having your Google in the other room hear you and start yakking off, scaring the crap out of you. Anyway, okay. Where was I? Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of political and cultural stuff in this book to unpack. It's basically Eastern Europe. But the Woodsmen are called, patrician. So they're patricians, which are followers of the Parthian-ish faith. Anyway, basically they're Christians versus the pagans. They worship a singular God. They call him God, Father, God, Life God, something like that. And the pagans follow different gods. Like they have like the God of heaven, the God of hell, and like very like Greek-ish sounding. And so they don't like them because they think they're pagan. Well, they call them pagans, but they also just think they're beneath them because they're heathens. So to say I didn't like this book would be inaccurate, because I finished it and I was actively intrigued with how it was going to resolve itself. But I also will probably never read this book again or read any other work by Ava Reed. So this book, okay, how do I even... So this book in general was kind of like a fantasy retelling of Eastern Europe. Like, you've got the Jewish culture that lives in the capital that's being run out by the people in the capital. You've got the pagans that are very similar to, like, I would say maybe like the Celts. And then you've got European society in the rest of the culture. And so like it was just interesting reading a not medieval fantasy that had those different cultural aspects in it. This book was so confusing. Like, so much of it felt underdeveloped. Like the magical system at all, I would say isn't even underdeveloped. It was just not developed. Like, there's a bunch of gods. It's heavily implied to me, or at least I took it to seem like all of the gods these different people are worshiping are all the same gods. They're just calling them something different. Like, the Godfather Life, or whatever Gaspar's people call him. The god that Gaspar's people, I want to say they call him Godfather. Father of Life, Godfather, something like that. He grants you powers if you sacrifice body parts or blood. Like, there's a lot. Okay, hang on. I should start over. It was saying there are trigger warnings aplenty in this book. This is pitched as an adult book, reads like a young adult book, has gore that is reminiscent of like grimdark and horror books, but a writing and developmental style that reads like young adult. So if you don't like body mutilation, gore, vivid descriptions of injury, you ain't gonna like this book. just you're not. So Godfather, Gaspar's people's religious deity, if you sacrifice stuff to him, whether it be like cutting your arm and bleeding or cutting off limbs, then he grants you powers. And it's implied in their religion that the more pious you are and the more honorific your sacrifices are, the more powerful your powers are. And they call them powers, but the pagans call it magic, and they pray to their gods and they're granted powers. But it's less of like a sacrificial thing. It's just kind of like you believe in the old gods and the gods give you stuff. And then, except there's the god of death who lives in the underworld, but they call it the third world because it's like 1, 2, 3, like the middle world. So there's the upper world, middle world, and then the hell. I can't remember if it's the lower world or underworld or something, where there's like a god of death. I can't remember what his name is. Sorry, folks. And if you sacrifice, she learns off pretty early in the book that if you sacrifice to him, like a body part, or like she cuts off her pinky, then he will give you powers. Which is why I very quickly felt like it was supposed to be implied, but never really touched on, that all of these gods that they're fighting all these wars on because they're different are actually the same. There's a lot of storytelling in this book. Vecchi tells a lot of stories of her gods to Gaspar while they're traveling. And he has very similar stories of his saints that are almost identical to her God stories. So it was very quickly obvious to me. I don't know if this is actually how she meant it, because she never comes back around to this. But it was implied that all the gods are the same. And you're all praying to the same things. You're just calling them different names. But she never really explains, like I said, she never really comes back around to that. So the magical system really is never developed. Like, why does Vecchi have the power to kill things, rust things, age things, harm things with her hand when she sacrifices her pinky? Like, why? Other than the implied, well, it's like the myth of the beautiful girl that tried to get dragged to the underworld. And she cut off her hand to escape him, and that's what she did. Like, other than, like, the similarities in the story of the gods, the author never really wraps back around with any of the magic. Like, is there an actual, like, are the gods all the same thing? Are there actual different gods? She never really, like, the magical system was so weirdly undeveloped that there's just a lot of, like, I guess that's why that worked. Like, I don't even think she knows why it works when she wrote it. Like, it's never explained or even, like, written into the world as explaining why the wolf girls have the 4 magics they do. Like, foraging, like, and sing a song, and now they have a spear. Like, it's really cool, and it's different and new, but, like, why? What? You know, like, aside from a bunch of myths that Vecchi tells Gaspar, where you're supposed to be like, yeah, I guess that's why, because that correlates with that myth. Like, the world, like, there was the world building, and then there was the magic building, and they, like, they never really quite melded, right? So, like, I felt like this, for how long this book is, for just over 400 pages, it's not as developed and fleshed out as it could have been. So this is categorized as just an adult fantasy. I would describe this as maybe grimdark, and maybe just straight up gore. I don't know, horror maybe. Oh, that's the other thing. There's monsters in this world that she never explains why. Like, creepy ass monsters that are just in the forests. And, like, Gaspar's people, the Christian people, explain the monsters away of, like, well, it's because we haven't rid the world of all the like, heathen magic and the pagans. That's why there's monsters around. But then the pagans are just like, meh, there's monsters. It's a welcome to life. But, like, the author never works into the story, like, where the fuck these monsters are coming from. Like, there's witches, but the witches are, like, weird golems of swamp stuff. Like, swamp mud and sticks and leaves, and, like, they make the form of a human. And then she, like, Hansel and Gretel's their ass. And then there's other monsters that are, like, made of maggots that chase them from the woods and try to eat them. But then there's also a dragon that's got multiple heads, I think, but can take the shape of a human, kind of. Like, where's these monsters coming from? And what the hell? Like, and aside from every now and then fighting one and getting injured, which is a whole other thing I'm going to talk about later, is the injuries. Aside from fighting them, getting injured, and it's generally slowing down their trek, the monsters had literally nothing to do with the plot at all. Not even a little bit. Like, you could take away all the monster fights, and it would have done nothing to the book except make it shorter. Like, the exact same story would have been told. And so I don't understand why those were there, because they served no purpose. And if they were serving a purpose, I've missed it. I don't know. Other than, like, it forces the 2 main characters into what I'm assuming was supposed to be, like, revelations and growing closer moments, but they don't really do that very effectively. So I'm still back to my original question of why are these here? And she never explains where the crap these monsters come from. They're just there, running amok, eating people. Well, yeah. So anyway, what the hell was I saying before I got oh yeah. So the gore level in this book is pretty high. Like, I've read Anita Blake Vampire Hunter books from Laurel King Hamilton before. So, like, the gore, I didn't have a problem with the gore. It was just weird because at no point reading this back flap, looking at this cover, did I think I was going to be reading, like, horror. And there's a lot of very she is so descriptive in her horror stuff, like the gore and the muscle and the sinew and the blood and the smell of things. She was very vivid on the smell of rotting people, and having smelled rotting people, I did not need that. It was very accurate though. But then on the other stuff, like, I don't know, like the writing language is very, very lyrical. It's very lyrical prose, but then you have like this juxtaposition of extremely vivid gore description that doesn't mesh. It was like she wrote a young adult book and then went, I want to put bloody stuff in it, and then wanted a rated R rating, and so she made an adult but didn't change anything else. There's just a lot of the writing didn't seem to mesh with each other. I don't know, this book, man. So this takes me to my next point that why I really just didn't like this book was for someone who is so descriptive, like purposefully vivid descriptions of bodies and injuries and gore and blood and stuff. She has no idea what a stab wound looks like or any kind of injuries. So this is literally a point towards the end of the book that was so that it made me reread it probably 4 times. And I still don't know where this woman got stabbed. So she makes a very explicit point of being like, ow, my arm hurts. And then she notices that she's been stabbed. Because she never says where. She's been stabbed. But she says the pain was in her arm. So I'm thinking like she gets stabbed here. Because where else would you be stabbed where it just makes your arm hurt? So she's talking about how her arm really hurts and she's been stabbed. So I'm thinking like in the muscle of her shoulder or something. And then she's talking about how she's bleeding so profusely that she's like getting lightheaded and that she's worried she's going to pass out, and her arm is slick with blood. And I'm like, there's not a lot of blood. There's no, unless you're digging past the bone, like there's nothing here that's going to do that to you. And then she said the kicker that made me go, what the fuck? She's like, and then the blood in my mouth. How in the hell did you get blood in your mouth from a shoulder wound? Like, even so now I'm like, okay, so if she's got blood in her mouth, maybe she got stabbed like in the pec of her shoulder, because like that would kind of make sense. Like if she clipped the lungs or something, then maybe that's why you got blood in your mouth. So I'm like, okay, like maybe you're a little wrong, but like I can give it to you. And then she describes how the character gets thrown down onto her back and lands on her wound, causing a bunch of pain. So I'm like, what? She's been stabbed in the back of her shoulder, but she's got blood in her mouth, but her arm's what's hurting. And she's bleeding so profusely that she's about to bleed to death. And at no point does she explain where the hell she actually got stabbed, because as far as I'm concerned, she's got organs over here that don't exist, because I don't know how that worked at all. I have no idea. It does not make any sense at all where this woman got stabbed. And then she's talking about how like, oh, I'll never be able to use a bow again, even if I do survive this. And I'm like, where the hell did this woman get stabbed? It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. And like a lot of her injury descriptions are like that. She's very convinced that if you're injured at all, you're bleeding from the mouth, which is just wrong. Like there are a lot of things that will make you bleed from the mouth, but getting stabbed in the arm, shoulder, well, isn't one of them. No, and so it's just like, it's so weird. Like she clearly did research to see what the inside of human bits look like to describe them so specifically, but then she couldn't do a little bit of research to be like, where should I stab her that it will have this kind of outcome? It didn't make any sense, and it just irritated me beyond measure. The other thing was in that little like 2-page fight scene, she describes her wound as the wound probably 6 times. Like, at that point, find the thesaurus, please. Because, like, the wound, my wound, the wound, the wound. And I'm like, where the fuck's the wound? And 2, really? That's the only word you can think of? It's fine. So the whole purpose is Gaspar wants to go find this magical bird that lives in the scary north. Because it's rumored to have all-seeing powers, and there's a myth, of course, that corresponds to Becky's life. It's like, it's a really magical bird. Anyway, so they spend half the book trying to find it. They give up. They go back to the capital. A bunch of stuff goes wrong at the capital. And then they go and find the bird again, and then they come back, and now they eat the bird's eyes, and the king can see the visions and goes crazy for about half a second, and then and then he dies, and then that's it. So the entire purpose of this book is trying to find this magical bird that's going to stop this war, and it has like a page of screen time, and then it's never used. Like, that's it. It's gone. That's it. There's no more use of the bird in the book. It was a lot of effort and build up for a book aspect that paid off very little, if anything. Like, I don't know. Once again, I just go back to the whole, this feels extremely underdeveloped. Like, this should have gone through a content editor one more time. And just, like, tightened everything up a little bit so that everything mushes. The other big issue I had with this book is I don't think this woman knows how time works and traveling. So, like, there's a map in this book that I referenced quite often. Also, in Ways of Maps, that's a terrible map. So freaking boring. Like, anyway, that's my own personal opinion. It has nothing to do with the content. It's just a boring map. So, they travel from, like, from the eastern, never eat soggy waffles. So they travel from the eastern corner of this country all the way up to, like, the northern corner, down to the center, back up to the north, and then back down to the center, okay? The time it takes them from going to the eastern corner up to the northern corner is, like, 4 weeks. And then the trip that it takes them to that corner down to, like the central southern corner is, like, 6 days. Like, it's not a lot. It's literally from here whoop, to here, whoop, to there. That was it. And it was 4 weeks versus 7 days. And I'm like, They're also traveling in, like, a terrible winter blizzard conditions most of the time, and they literally just have the clothes on their backs. And they're just like, yeah, I'm just going to lay down next to this stump. I'll be fine. What? No, that's not how wilderness works. No, I don't care how magical your stolen wolf cloak is. That's not how that works. Like, and then, like, when Iveki is at the capital, she's there. I think I was able to pinpoint 5, 6 days. Maybe, okay, somewhere between 6 to 8 days she's at the capital. And the amount of personal growth that she goes through in those 5 to 9 days is incredible, let me tell you. Like, the personal growth that she goes through and growing up that happens would make complete sense if she was there for a month, 2 months, right? But she's there for barely a week. And it's like she's a completely different person. She sees one bad thing happen to her. She finds her dad. She sees one bad thing happen to her dad. And suddenly she's like, oh my God, Gaspar is right. I've been a horrible person. And, like, completely switches personalities. I don't know. It's just, I had to give this book 3 stars. And I kind of feel like that might have been generous. Like, the storyline was captivating enough that I wanted to see how it ended. I didn't just DNF it. But there are a lot of parts in this book where I'm like, what the? And then, like, so this entire book is very, very doom and gloom and, like, you know how Greek tragedies are meant to have a bad ending? Like, they're not meant to end happy. That's what I thought this was going to do. Like, reading this, I'm like, Iveki's going to die. Gaspar's going to die. Someone important is going to die. And this is just going to end with the world sucks. Because that's the vibe of this entire book. But the ending was, like, almost too good. Like, unrealistically good. Like, so his country, I can't remember what the hell it's called because names and me don't get along. Gee, there's a lot of S and V's in there. And his country, Gaspar's country, is at war with the country to the south. His mother's from the south. His mother died, so now they're warring with the south again. So the book ends with Gaspar taking the throne, becoming the king, and, like, instituting a council that has members from all of the different cultures. So he's got, like, people representing the pagan tribes. He's got people representing the people of the north that have kind of, like, hidden out and Game of Thrones did. He's got people representing the Yahuli, got people representing the Christian society, and they're moving towards happiness and peace. And there's like a tentative peace established with the people of the South that they've been at war with for generations. Like, cool. How the hell did we get there, though? Like, for the author has a degree in religion and ethnic nationalism, and she has an entire like talking points in the back of the book about depoliticizing Eastern European fantasy. So this woman knows politics. Like, she understands how culture and politics and all of those complicated, messy connections affect worlds. But she wrote such an unrealistic ending. Like, really think that a country that hates pagans and paganism so badly that they're stoning them to death in the streets and they're trying to fix them because their pagan gods are what's responsible for the world ending, are going to be okay with one sitting on their council literally from one day to the next? Like, the book ends with another undisclosed period of time having passed, but not a lot. Like, I don't know, maybe there is some time, because she's talking about, this is the other thing that irritates me, is that her passage of time has no uniformity to it. So the book ends with her talking about how, like Vecchi talking about how people that used to scorn her and make fun of her and beat her and stuff in the tribe were now chasing around their own small children, which would imply several years had passed, right? At least 9 months plus, like, what, another 8 to 10 for the kid to start waddling around. So at least a year and a half has passed. But the way the conversation goes between the characters, it feels like no time at all has passed. And it just doesn't make any sense. I don't know. This book was very confusing for me. I enjoyed reading it. I don't think I actually liked the book, though. I know I'm not going to read there's another book from this author and another thing. So the other book from this author, I read the description or whatever to see if maybe she redeems herself and gets better, because this is a debut novel. She starts talking about witches and how she's witches and warlocks. But in this book, she explains that witches are demon monsters made of swamp pieces. So how are you going to have another book based in the same world where the main character's a witch, when you've already established that the witch are human-eating monster bits made out of mud? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, if you like grimdark, if you like the OG grim fairy tales and that level of weird, gory storytelling, then you might actually enjoy this book just fine. There's just so many execution issues with this book that I struggled to give it even the 3 stars that I did. I don't know. Which is sad, because reading the little Barnes & Noble blurby of it and then the back flap of this, I had such high hopes for this. Oh yeah, it was pitched as a cinnamon roll goodness protective. No, she's an asshole. The majority of the book, she just poke. Like poor Gaspar, who, the character of Gaspar, got me all riled up. The character of Gaspar is written like he's supposed to be another, they're both outcasts. He's an outcast because he's got darker skin than the rest of the country because his mother's from the South. She's an outcast because she doesn't have any magic from her people. They've both been mistreated and abused by their respective peoples. And so there's that weird bonding level of otherness between the two of them. So he's written as a softer version of I've learned to adapt by keeping quiet and observing, while Vecchi's learned to adapt by fighting back and being mean. And you can see that in the book, that Gaspar is trying, he doesn't like the pagans, he doesn't appreciate their religion, he thinks they're heathens. But when she starts telling him stories, he's like, oh, that's interesting, tell me more. But then she's just you're a horrible person, jab, 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 constantly, and has no growth until the last 50 pages of the book. And then she grows up. I don't know. It felt like a half-done idea. I don't know. I don't know. It was a very confusing read. It does not feel like an adult fantasy book, but it is for sure not a young adult book. But lyrically, narratively, and like in terms of most of its themes, I would say it fits more of a young adult book, you know, aside from the gore. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, this was a weird one. I now understand why so many of the reviews were either like absolutely loved it or absolutely hated it, because I'm very confused about how I feel about this book. But I mean, if you like grimdark, if you like the original Grimm fairy tales, if you like a darker, meaner fantasy, then for sure you'll totally dig this. I just wish it connected a little bit better. I think it just wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Because I like dark stuff. Like, I used to read, like, if y'all haven't read Laurel K. Hamilton stuff, yeah, her Anita Blake books are dark. like old school Anne Rice level dark of like vampires or mean things. So I enjoy a good gore. The gore wasn't what bothered me. It bothered a lot of people, but the gore wasn't what bothered me. It was the execution and the melding of everything that bothered me. I don't know. Maybe the author fixes these issues in her later books. I don't know. I have no interest to read the next one though, so maybe we'll see. But I don't know. If you guys have read this book, I would be more than interested in like talking about it, because I just have really confusing feelings about this book. It wasn't amazing. It was poorly executed in a lot of places, but it was refreshingly different. Like, I felt like I was reading a fairy tale, which maybe is why I kind of want to call it a Red Riding Hood retelling, even though it definitely isn't. But it felt like reading a Grimm's Brother fairy tale, which is maybe why I didn't put it down initially. And I was able to carry through. I don't know. Anyway, that was my rambling review of The Wolf and the Woodsman by Ava Reid. It's disappointing. It sounded like it was going to be so much better. And like the cuddling for warmth and like the forbidden lovers thing, there was so much weird anger and like, I'm going to hell because I love you-ness attached to it, that it wasn't even like, oh, forbidden lovers. It was like, ugh, leave him alone. Like, he's going to chop his own hand off to try to repent for this. I don't know. It was just, didn't have the fluffy enemies to lover vibes that I liked. It was like they fell in love in spite of their efforts to, and they're angry at themselves for it. So I don't know. When they finally did admit their feelings to each other, it wasn't, I don't know, it's just weird. It still didn't have the like, yay. It was just kind of weird. It was very regretful the whole time. I don't know. It was strange. Anyway, thanks for sticking into that rambling review. I'll tag it for spoilers up front so that everybody knows. I forgot to say that. Sorry. Like I always do. Anyway, thanks for tagging along. Let me know what your thoughts are if you've read this, if you haven't read it, or if you guys have read her other book. What are your thoughts on her other one? Should I give it a try? Is it as, like, is the witch thing as weird as I think it is? I don't know. Anyway, tell me your thoughts. Let me know. And I'll see you guys on the next one.